This video we're going to be looking at Romanian orphan studies and the effects of institutionalisation. So these are two key areas at the end of the attachment topic, and you could get asked about either one. So you might be asked a question that's focusing on the effects of institutionalisation, so what are the developmental consequences for children raised in institutions, or you might get specific questions asking about Romanian orphan studies, in which case it's really important that you know the aims, procedures, findings and conclusions. Okay, so when we're talking about institutionalisation, we're really talking about the behaviour patterns of children who have been raised in institutions. By institutions, we're talking about orphanages, hospitals, places where people are living for a long, continuous period of time. And in institutions, particularly orphanages, very often very little emotional care is provided. So the children might have a variety of different staff members they are seeing at sort of irregular intervals, and they therefore aren't able to form an attachment to any one person. So here we're really looking at what are the consequences of emotional neglect. So we're going to be looking at 4 key effects of institutionalisation, as well as some really important research into these consequences. Before we get into the Romanian orphan study and consequences, it's really important that you've got some sort of context about, where these Romanian orphans came from and why they're so important to our understanding of developmental psychology. So, although this isn't knowledge that you need to know, I just want to give you some background. So, basically, Romania was under a communist dictatorship under the rule of Nicolae Ceausescu, who introduced pro-natalist policies. So essentially, he made it compulsory for all women to have 5 children, and he would tax them heavily if they weren't having 5 children. He banned contraception, he banned abortion, with the idea being that a stronger population meant that there were more workers to improve the economy. All of this was happening at the same time that there was severe famine and food shortages. So they were exporting all of their produce abroad to fund his palaces that he was building for himself. And it meant that basically the country was starving, was often without electricity and power, and that there were, it's unknown the exact figure, but it's estimated between 100,000 and 500,000 children who were born under this regime who ended up in these orphanages and institutions. So many of these children were not orphans in the true sense. Their parents were alive, but were just totally unable to care for them. And so they would often be dropped at a hospital, then raised in institutions until they reached an age where they were then able to work. And then they might be picked up by their parents again and brought back to the house. Or, unfortunately, at the age of 18, the children would then just be kicked out on the streets to fend for themselves. So this was the state of Romania at the time, and this is where the Romanian orphans come from. In 1989, an American film crew entered Romania after the fall of the communist regime, and for the first time could see the true extent of the damage that Ceausescu had caused, and was able to see these children who were being raised in institutions. And it really caught the attention of the entire world. If you ask your parents about it, I'm sure they'll be aware of the plight of the Romanian orphans. And everybody was really, really interested. And it meant that lots of these children were then adopted abroad. So a lot of these children ended up being adopted by Australian parents and American, Canadian parents, and a lot adopted by British parents as well. So it was a horrible situation and just horrific conditions for these children to be raised in. But it did provide researchers a really important opportunity to, for the first time, research the effects of neglect and institutionalisation on a wide scale. So before this, we really had just individual case studies like Genie, which were really unique and really hard for us to form any conclusions and generalisations from. But now here we are with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of children who have been raised in similar circumstances and have not been able to form attachments in that critical period. And here we can now actually assess what these consequences are going to be over a long period of time. So really important research that is still ongoing today. So I hope that I've been able to just emphasise how important these Romanian orphans are for our understanding of development and the importance of attachment. So the big question that came out of Romanian orphan studies was, what are the effects of institutionalisation? So we're going to be looking at 4 key effects here. So the first is physical underdevelopment, then intellectual underfunctioning or cognitive impairments, particularly low IQ. We're going to be looking at a specific form of insecure attachment, which we haven't come across yet, which is called disinhibited attachment. And then we'll look at poor parenting as well. Interestingly, these effects really are unique to institutionalized children. So we don't typically see these effects for children that have suffered from other types of abuse or neglect. So we don't see these in children who have experienced early childhood physical or sexual abuse, for example. They seem to be fairly unique to institutionalized children. So the first effect of institutionalization is physical underdevelopment. And you'll recognize this from the case study of Jeannie. So children who are raised in institutions suffer from something unique called deprivation dwarfism, which is where they are just physically underdeveloped. You'll remember from Jeannie that she was discovered at the age of 13, except the police thought she was around 6 or 7 years old because she was just so physically small in size and stature that she looked like she was much younger than she actually was. And this is despite getting satisfactory nourishment. So a lot of the children who were raised in orphanages were provided nutrients, were fed 3 meals a day, but still just didn't develop in line with non-institutionalized children. And so we see this deprivation dwarfism, which means sort of smaller head circumference. They are shorter. And yeah, just physically much, much smaller than non-institutionalized children. And this is one of the effects that we also see in the Romanian orphans. The second effect of institutionalization is intellectual underfunctioning, or this is suffering from cognitive impairment. Sometimes this is referred to as quasi-autism. This is where children who have suffered from prolonged separation from their families often have profoundly disturbed cognitive development and lag behind in terms of IQ. So they've typically got language and communication issues, they've got poor understanding of social interactions, they might show behaviours like rocking, which we typically associate with autism. And this is purely an effect of the institutionalization. And what this meant for a lot of the Romanian orphans was that they were wrongly diagnosed as having an intellectual disorder, when in fact they didn't. It was just a consequence of being in that situation. So we see with institutionalized children, they score very poorly on IQ tests. So IQ average is 100. These children are often suffering from IQs of less than 70. Less than 2 standard deviations from the mean. So quite significant delays in intellectual development there. But a really interesting finding is what we see when these children do then receive sufficient emotional care. So when they are then adopted into loving, caring families, their IQ can improve by upwards of 30 points, provided that adoption and loving care is provided early enough. So this isn't necessarily permanent. These effects can be overcome with sufficient emotional care. The third effect of institutionalization is a type of insecure attachment called disinhibited attachment. And this is where children are unable to differentiate and discriminate between people. So they will not show any differences in their response to a caregiver who is known to them, who is familiar, who loves them, and a stranger. And so they'll treat strangers with inappropriate familiarity. And this can be seen through their behavior. It can also be seen in brain scans as well. So when we conduct neuroimaging research, we can see that the brains of these children do not respond differently to a stranger and a loved one. And so we can see that there are neural explanations for this. So this isn't just shown in their behavior, but we see some physiological differences between institutionalized children and controlled children. So inappropriate familiarity with strangers and attention seeking are the 2 hallmarks of this type of insecure attachment. And this is really just a coping mechanism. These children have been unable to form secure, long-lasting, continuous attachments with caregivers while they were raised in an institution. And so this is really an adaptation to living with multiple caregivers during that critical period of development. And the final effect of institutionalization is poor parenting. Institutionalized children may become poor parents later in life. And as we know, this links to Bowlby's idea of the internal working model. So there's 2 key pieces of research that we can look at here. The reason we're not referring to the Romanian orphans here is because they're only really now reaching an age where they're having children of their own. So now is a really crucial time for Romanian orphan research, because we're able to see what the consequences are then for the next generation, to see if there is this continuity of attachment type across generations. But the 2 key pieces of research is first piece by Quinton, which found that women who were raised in institutions had extreme difficulty when they were acting as parents. So in the Quinton study, they compared a group of 50 women who had been raised in institutions with a control group of 50 women who were raised in a normal environment. And they found that when the institutionalized children were in their 20s, they were experiencing extreme difficulties acting as parents. But the children who had been raised in a normal environment had healthy models of parenting and were healthy parents. So it seems like people who have been raised in institutions are then unable to be fit parents themselves later on. And quite often we see the children of people who had been raised in institutions also finding themselves institutionalized because of this. And another piece of research you'll be very familiar with is Harlow's research into contact comfort when he was testing the cupboard love theory. So Harlow found that the children who were raised in isolation, so the children who were raised only with a wire mother without a cloth mother, went on to become poor mothers themselves. So many of those monkeys rejected their own offspring. They were quite often abusive to their offspring. They would engage in just horrifically aggressive acts like pulling the fingers off their young children. Really horrible situation there. And so while we don't have that much evidence yet about the effects of poor parenting for the Romanian orphans, we can look at findings from elsewhere, from Quinton and Harlow. Okay, so they're the four main effects of institutionalisation. Now let's look at the main piece of research into Romanian orphans. So this is Rutter's ERA study. ERA stands for English Romanian Adoptee. Study, and this is the key Romanian orphan study. We'll be looking at another one as well, but this is your main study. So here you should be knowing the aims, procedures, findings, and conclusions. So Rutter is researching the effects of institutionalisation on intellectual development and attachment type. And here we can see a picture of a Romanian orphan now. I mean, this photo is still probably a little bit outdated, but this is the age the Romanian orphans are at now. So this is an ongoing piece of research. It's longitudinal. And so it's following these orphans from the age of adoption, from when they were either 6 months or up to 2 years old, throughout life. So we're studying a group of 165 Romanian children who are adopted by British families, hence why this is known as the English Romanian Adoptee Study. So these children were assessed at a variety of ages. I think they're being assessed again now, and this research is being conducted by UCL in London, which is really exciting. And they're assessed on a variety of different measures. So they're assessed on the parental reports of their willingness to go off with strangers. Obviously, this is testing their disinhibited attachment tendencies. They have been conducting home observations to see, again, disinhibited attachment, whether the child will be showing inappropriate familiarity with strangers, whether they'll be showing attention-seeking behaviour, for example. They have conducted teacher and parent reports. They've conducted IQ tests. They've also more recently been conducting neuroimaging. So scanning the brains of these Romanian orphans to see how they might differ to control children. Okay, so moving on, or carrying on with the procedure. Now, this is a natural experiment. If you can't remember what that is, I would suggest you go back and review your notes on types of experiments. This is going to be really important to understand when it comes to evaluating this research. So in this experiment, the independent variable, the variable that is manipulated, is the age of adoption. The reason this is a natural study rather than a lab experiment is because that independent variable, the age of adoption, was not manipulated by the researchers. They did not randomly allocate children to these conditions. These conditions emerged because the parents adopted these children, and they chose which children to adopt. So these groups naturally occurred. They already existed because the parents had chosen to adopt particular children at particular ages. And Rutter and others just simply utilised these groups that naturally emerged and measured then the dependent variable, which was things like IQ, attachment type, etc. So we'll come back to this later. So a natural experiment which left us with 3 experimental groups and a control group. So our control group consisted of 52 British children who were adopted around the same age as our Romanian orphans, but were not raised in institutions. Then we have our group 1. Now, these children were adopted before they were 6 months old. That's all you really need to know. You don't need to commit to memory the number of children and the proportion of boys and girls. Our first group is Romanian adoptees who were adopted before 6 months. Group 2 were adopted between 6 months and 2 years. And Group 3 were adopted between 2 years and 4 years. So, what do we actually find then when we look at the developmental outcomes of these Romanian orphans? So when they first arrived in the UK, they were showing, or half of the children were showing signs of delayed intellectual development and physical underdevelopment, which are some of the consequences of institutionalisation. At age 11, we see differences in cognitive development appear. So those that were adopted before 6 months, those who were adopted younger, had a mean IQ of 102. Now remember that average IQ is 100. So these children had average IQ, and they were developing perfectly in line with the British control group. Group 2, these children were adopted between 6 months and 2 years. They had a mean IQ of 86. That's 1 standard deviation below the mean. That's significant. They're also showing signs of disinhibited attachment, that over-familiarity with strangers and attention-seeking behaviour, and they were having problems forming peer relationships at school. They were also having difficulties forming attachments to their adoptive parents. Unfortunately, the consequences were even more severe for those that were adopted between 2 years and 4 years. So they had a mean IQ of 77, so this is about 1.5 standard deviations below the mean. They were also showing signs of disinhibited attachment and difficulties forming peer relationships. And these IQ differences remained at age 16 as well. So what can we conclude from this? Well, it seems like the effects of institutionalisation can be overcome if an attachment is formed within the first 6 months. But if an attachment is formed after 6 months, if that emotional care is provided after 6 months, the effects of institutionalisation tend to be more permanent. And this can help support the idea of a critical period, or at least a sensitive period.